So we've heard a lot in the past 2 days about Zika because it's very much front and center in our minds. So I will skip over the details because I think they have been well covered and many of us have been following the news and the scientific developments in this space. But just to say that it does fall under this public health emergency of international concern category. And since that declaration and since those first inclinations that we had last fall, that Zika might be related to these congenital malformations, specifically microcephaly, and as we've learned since, many more concerns around normal fetal development, congenital malformations, and abnormalities even in infancy. It's become a deepening concern, and there's been a lot of efforts to try and figure out how we can address this next epidemic. So a little bit about what we know. It's a flavivirus, so it's very similar in many ways to dengue, chikungunya, yellow fever, except that it's different in one important way, in that it's also sexually transmitted. So this just, again, makes us think that there might be something that would be particularly relevant to pregnancy and pregnant women who we know are having unprotected sex. And again, the main concern is really around the outcomes associated with Zika infection during pregnancy and what it can do to the normal development of the fetus and the subsequent child that's born. So in some ways, this is one epidemic where we can't ignore pregnant women because they're at the center of the epidemic. They're at the center of the biggest concerns of Zika infection. So we have to be considering pregnant women, both in the response as well as in the research that we do that's going to inform what that response should look like. This brings to the forefront all of the things that we've been talking about over the past day and a half, the legal, ethical, and logistical challenges of doing this research that's inclusive of pregnant women. And they're compounded by, as Melba mentioned, this sense of urgency that's associated with the public health emergency context. At the same time, while this is really challenging and it's complex, it gives us an opportunity to dig in and really look at these challenges and say, we have to address it in this epidemic. We can't afford to ignore pregnant women when it comes to Zika. So this is a time for us really to bring this to the forefront and figure out what kinds of opportunities there are to move forward in ways that other areas of health we haven't had this kind of opportunity to focus on pregnancy and pregnant women. So Zika vaccine research is ongoing. There's a number of products in the pipeline right now that are in preclinical development, as well as some that have entered into phase 1 early in human trials. And this is because it's going to be a really important tool for us to have to combat this virus and this epidemic. Now, this, of course, has to go alongside other efforts like vector control, like access to appropriate family planning and contraceptives. But we know that that's not going to be enough, that we are going to need in our toolkit an efficacious vaccine so that we can prevent new Zika infection during pregnancy in this epidemic as well as in the next to come. And it seems like every time you look at the news, there's some new information about a trial that's starting, a new vaccine candidate that's entering the pipeline, and all of the developments that are going along with this rapid development cycle. So again, this makes us question, for all of these vaccine candidates that are moving into these trials, how can we think ahead about whether, when, and how we can include pregnant women? So this question of why we have to consider pregnant women may seem, well, obviously we have to include pregnant women, but it may not be that simple. So according to the WHO's target product profile, the main target of a vaccine for Zika is women of childbearing age. So a lot of vaccine developers said, oh, whew, great, we don't have to think about pregnant women, we can vaccinate around them. The most important thing is that we get them the vaccine before they're pregnant. While that will still be a very important part of the response, getting to women before they're even at risk and before their fetuses are at risk of Zika infection, we still have to be very cognizant of the need for vaccines in pregnancy in women that are actively pregnant, not just before their pregnancy. And the reason is because there's going to be women who are currently pregnant during a Zika epidemic that are going to desperately want and desperately need an intervention that can protect themselves and their fetuses from Zika infection. One thing that we learned early on, we thought that the risks associated with Zika infection were limited to infection in that first trimester, and the more and more data that we collect, we're seeing that these risks, which go far beyond microcephaly to all sorts of abnormalities related to neurological complications, joint problems, eye problems as well, may persist well beyond that first trimester and potentially even into early infancy. The second is, particularly in a public health emergency, trial participation represents an opportunity to get early access to an intervention that might be potentially beneficial. We also know that a lack of evidence, if we don't generate this evidence now, it could lead to exclusionary policies down the road when we do have an efficacious vaccine that we would more broadly roll out. And lastly, because this is also a sexually transmitted infection, we know that there might be greater risks of infection during pregnancy because there might be less condom use in sex intercourse. Leaving all of that aside about why it might be important to have something to offer women who are knowingly pregnant, we also know that in the past, when we do wide-scale rollout of vaccines, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of women who are inadvertently exposed early in pregnancy before they're aware. And it's going to be incredibly important that we have some safety data to give them so that they know what that inadvertent exposure means, whether there's really no risk to be worried about, whether there is a risk to be worried about, and that can inform their care decisions. So this is going to happen likely in the context of trials. There's going to be women who enroll who don't know their pregnancy status and get the exposure. There's going to be women in trials who enroll and there's multiple doses and become pregnant, and whether or not they should continue and stay on those doses. There's also going to be, in that wider scale rollout, women who are going to be exposed. So we really need to have that data to be able to give them answers. And we saw in the rubella response that there was a very long period where there was intense fear and anxiety about these inadvertent exposures to the rubella vaccine that led to unnecessary pregnancy terminations. So all of these abortions happened because of this intense fear. And it took us years to say, oh, actually, there's no problem. There doesn't seem to be any adverse outcomes for the child associated with an inadvertent live vaccine for rubella. And the policies changed, but it took a very long time to get there and to get that data. So here's just a quick snapshot of some of the vaccines that are currently in the pipeline. And among them, there's this subset of live vaccines. And while there will be questions around all of these vaccines and the trials that are down on the horizon, there's particularly tricky questions around this live vaccine debate and where they should fit into this research agenda. So on the one hand, we know that live vaccines are a really important tool for how we tackle epidemics and disease. They tend to have some comparative advantages over other vaccines. For instance, often they only require one dose, so that means that we can have greater coverage within the population who's immunologically protected, and it may be easier to actually roll out and implement, and maybe a little bit less cost. They tend to have longer durability, so people stay immune much longer, whereas with other kinds of vaccines, you often need to have multiple doses and potentially come back years later with a booster. We also know that because of these characteristics, there may be a greater value for money proposition. So if I am a government trying to decide what I include in my vaccine schedule moving forward and how I'm going to respond, this might be the most likely platform, if there's many, that I would adopt, particularly because I'm not just thinking about pregnant women, I'm trying to get the women of childbearing age as well. So this is very likely to be the kind of platform that would be introduced both in the near term and in the longer term Zika response. What's more is that these other vaccine candidates that are in the pipeline, there's no guarantee that any of them will be effective. So it may be the case that we only get one of these 22 or 18, depending on which numbers you look at, that's actually efficacious, that actually works. And it may be that that is a live vaccine. So we have to start thinking now about all of these contingencies and how we ensure that there's something that will be reasonably available to pregnant women who are desperately in need of interventions. But this is tricky because the conventional wisdom is that we don't give live vaccines in pregnancy. Historically, for all live vaccines, they have been contraindicated for use. And this is because live vaccines, even though they're attenuated, they're weakened viruses, they include a portion of the virus that can replicate. So theoretically, there's a risk that this attenuated virus, when injected into the body, could replicate and infect the fetus and cause harm. At the same time, we have data from inadvertent exposures from other diseases, from yellow fever, from rubella, from polio, and we have yet to see any actual evidence that this theoretical risk exists. And in some cases, so for yellow fever and for polio, we actually recommend that in the context of an outbreak, when there's a high risk of infection, despite this theoretical risk still being there, we recommend that we use it. It's important that we use it. The benefits of giving the vaccine far outweigh this theoretical risk that we've yet to observe. So just a quick snapshot, some of the pros and cons of why we would think about live vaccine use in pregnancy. So then this raises really tough questions for what do we do in the context of research and development. So should pregnant women be allowed to participate in trials of live vaccine candidates? So if we're going to do a trial in an area that has very high transmission of Zika, how do we weigh the risks and benefits? And it's very likely that a phase 3 trial will go into an area where there is high rates of transmission. This risk-benefit calculus is really tricky because on the one hand, we've got a theoretical risk that have yet to be substantiated, and it's a different virus from the other one, so we can't treat it entirely the same. We also don't know a whole lot about Zika generally and the risks of whether or not if a woman gets infected during pregnancy, at which trimester, and what her levels of viremia are, the likelihood that she would pass it on to the child and that would in turn result in congenital malformation. So we don't have very good estimates yet, and we're still really figuring out what the background risks are and also what the potential risks would be of the vaccine. But it becomes difficult because we have to start thinking about this now with our limited data because we're moving so quickly in this emergency context. The second piece is how social justice considerations should influence these decisions, because this is an opportunity to get earlier access to a potentially beneficial vaccine through trial participation. So if we're going into these areas where there's real fear and real risk of Zika infection, is it okay to deny women an opportunity to participate in these trials if they're desperately looking for something to protect themselves and their fetus? And then more broadly, what are the considerations and the conditions that are relevant to justify a prospective enrollment of pregnant women in a live Zika vaccine trial? How might this compare or contrast in the case of Zika versus other kinds of epidemics? So we heard about Ebola, and we'll hear a little bit more about it, but is there something different about Zika, and how can we think about the relevant disease factors as we assess this question? And then there's this question about what are the potential implications? What are the risks of not including pregnant women in live vaccine research? So how might it influence their future access to an efficacious live vaccine? So we heard in the case of Ebola that by not including them, it's very unlikely in the next outbreak that they're going to be able to access an efficacious Ebola vaccine. So what can we learn from that experience as we think about the context of Zika? There's also, as I mentioned in the case of rubella, there's the potential that by not doing this research now, there's going to be misplaced fear and anxiety among women who are inevitably going to get inadvertently vaccinated and exposed. And we want to avoid, particularly in areas where it may be very risky and very difficult to get a safe termination of the pregnancy, unnecessary terminations. So having that safety data is going to be crucial. But we know it may be very difficult, and it may actually be ethically justified not to include them. So we're still working through the ethics here, and in part because we don't have full information. So if pregnant women are not included in trials, there's still an obligation to generate the best possible evidence that we can on the safety, potentially on the efficacy, but definitely on the safety, so that we can inform relevant healthcare decisions. So what can we be learning now as all sorts of preclinical studies are happening, as non-human primate trials are happening, and different kinds of animal models are being explored? What can we learn in the context of clinical trials? So we know in these larger scale trials there's going to be inadvertent exposures. How can we think really carefully about the opportunities to collect data in those contexts? Similarly, when we start rolling something out more broadly to the population, how can we be really smart and strategic to get the best quality evidence we can from the first group of women that are exposed to this in pregnancy, so that we can inform future use? At the same time, we have to think about the pros and cons of relying solely on animal models and inadvertent exposures. So we know not all animal models are that great, and sometimes data from animal models can actually delay or restrict access to a compound that would actually be very beneficial and not pose that. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. We're not mice. We have very different physiologies. So sometimes something that you see in a reprotox study, in an animal model, doesn't pan out to actually have those same risks. And so relying solely on that without doing the human trials may really delay or exclude pregnant women from the benefits of these compounds. There's also questions around scientific validity more broadly. So we know that we do a ton of observational research, and it's really valuable, but it's not the gold standard RCT. And the community, policymakers, scientific community, don't look at it the same way. So it takes often a lot more observational data and a lot more confidence in that data to influence policy and practice. There's also questions surrounding distributive justice. If we're relying solely on those people who are going to be inadvertently exposed, and there's going to be a lot more of them, and it's going to take a lot longer, is it fair to put that risk onto them in order to answer these questions, onto many more of them, and delay, in the meantime, answers to the rest of the population? And this last question relates to a lot of conversations we've been having over the past day and a half, is how do we think about all of these questions in the context in which these trials are going to take place? How should the local norms, values, and culture, as well as the legal and regulatory backgrounds that are present in these places, influence and shape the way we think about these questions of when and where we would consider including pregnant women in these trials? So this includes, but it's not limited to, what kind of background interaction there is with the health system, what sorts of family planning services are available, as well as access to abortion services. What are the local conceptions of disease, of disability, the available services for people who are living with disability? So if these women do have children that have excessive needs because of their congenital Zika syndrome, what's available to them? The roles and the norms for shared decision-making among family members. This has come up again and again. In what ways partners can, should, maybe be involved in these kinds of enrollment decisions. As well as some of the things that we've been seeing generally around gender norms in the context of Zika. How we might think about potential for gender-based violence in the context of these trials, which we certainly would want to avoid, particularly for women who are already incredibly disadvantaged and facing all sorts of barriers and circumstances that are difficult in their day-to-day lives. We wouldn't want to introduce new challenges. And one thing that we've seen is some reports of abandonment, that women who are giving birth to babies who are affected by Zika are being abandoned by their partners. So thinking about all of that in the context of what we should be giving them access to and when, and how we can create appropriate evidence to ensure that pregnant women's needs are met in the Zika response. So I've posed a lot of questions. I don't have all the answers. We're working collaboratively with a big team to explore, not just in the context of live vaccines, but more broadly in the vaccine pipeline, when and whether and how pregnant women should be included in research. But I think it poses some really important questions surrounding what we can learn from our collective experiences, where have we done well in the past, and what are the good models for the success stories and how we can apply that to the current epidemic. Where have we failed and where do we need to do better? What can we learn from the Zika case that might be relevant to the next public health emergency of international concern? Particularly because pregnancy is front and center here. So maybe there are certain things that we can achieve in the context of Zika that will further advance the broader inclusion of pregnant women's needs in the research agenda for all kinds of diseases and epidemics. And then this other piece about beyond Zika generally, there's such a strong dogma that we shouldn't use live vaccines in pregnancy. And is it time to revisit this? Is it time to question whether or not the benefits associated with live vaccines may outweigh this theoretical risk that we've yet to see evidence of? And to start to question that and say, maybe this isn't the right kind of determination to categorically exclude them from live vaccines and live vaccine research. So just a quick acknowledgement, this is a collaborative effort across multiple universities with generous funding support from the Wellcome Trust. We have many colleagues here today, so I just want to extend my thank you to them, and also to many partners who have engaged in consultations, in sort of helping us understand the science that's going on around this. So I'm very grateful to all of the inputs that we've had from partners, colleagues, collaborators, as well as to the funders for allowing this work to happen.
So thank you so much, Carleigh, for your excellent presentation. I think it brought out a lot of issues, complex issues that we need to talk about. We are running a little late, but I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions for Carleigh's presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much for these 2 excellent presentations. And I would like to comment on 5 points.
Get my pen.
It's mainly raising these because I felt that they weren't necessarily included in these presentations. So the first one is looking at benefit risk assessment of vaccines during pregnancy. So you focus primarily on live vaccines. Just wanted to point out it's also really important to look at adjuvants and vectors that might be included in these vaccines. We had a nice primer on Zika 2 days ago, but just for general information. So this became very relevant for Ebola, because those 2 vaccines were actually constructs that had adverse safety data in their phase 1 and phase 2 trials. So those are 2 vaccines that are not really geared towards use in the general population. That's very, very important, because those companies were actually facing existing safety data that weren't supportive for use in pregnancy. So you see that's a very special situation where you have to consider what's the benefit and what's the risk. And then related to that from a manufacturer perspective, I think very important to touch on is the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, which I think hasn't come up yet. It's a US-based mechanism which allows anyone who has a claim for a potential vaccine-associated injury in infants and children to claim compensation from a governmental fund. So meaning the manufacturers are not the ones who are held responsible on a financial basis, which is extremely important. And there is a push towards extending that to being able to claim that compensation for the fetus as well. So I think a discussion point would be, and also a policy point would be, how do you adapt that? Which, you know, the extension to fetus is supported for maternization, but in an emergency situation, I think we need to discuss about potential adaptation of that act, you know, for application emergency, because these manufacturers are all US-based manufacturers, so that's what guides their legal decision making. Then thirdly, the role of WHO, which I think is really crucial and critical. And I think for the Zika example, WHO is playing a very, very crucial role in defining key criteria for clinical development of Zika. And very supportively, the current WHO TPP, target product profile for Zika, includes a parallel path. So including pregnant women at a much earlier stage than would normally be the case. So this is a huge change towards previously, was affected, I would think, by both Ebola as well as Zika. And we shouldn't underestimate the role of both the WHO as well as the global health community in influencing manufacturer strategies in clinical development. Then fourthly, the country perspective. I would be interested to hear whether there was a push or voice from the countries to include pregnant women. So for example, for Ebola. So if everyone knows that these are the people at greatest risk, did the countries have a voice in demanding that pregnant women should be included in these trials? And you know, the other aspect of that is, of course, that oftentimes in such situations, countries have a concern that their populations are being used as guinea pigs. So that's another policy and also political issue to consider. And then lastly, you know, just historically from maternization, most of the safety data we have are actually generated during these outbreaks. So like yellow fever and whatever. So maybe we need to start thinking about systems that can effectively capture these data moving forward. Because I think one of you said that we're still at the stage of not having any data available, although most likely pregnant women were included in these programs.
Great, thank you, Ajoki. That was a lot. I'll see if I can respond to at least a few of those points, and I'll try to keep it short in the interest of time. So the first part on the adjuvants, absolutely. I mean, you can't make blanket statements about platforms of vaccines, and each particular vaccine carries its own potential risks, and certain adjuvants are much more acceptable for use in pregnancy compared to other ones where we don't have very good data on use in pregnancy, or they might actually be appropriately contraindicated. So yes, it's very important to look very specifically at the vaccine. This was meant to be a little bit provocative because there is a blanket sort of general knee-jerk reaction to say, well, no, you really can't do live vaccines in pregnancy, and to question whether or not that's the right kind of conventional wisdom that we should be taking. The compensation program, so the VICP, is, I think, an incredibly useful tool, and we've talked a lot about incentives and changing those incentives, particularly around liability when it comes to drug developers. And our legal team has been looking very carefully both at the vaccine injury compensation program as well as the CICP, which is the one that would kick in also in the context of public health emergencies, to try and figure out what opportunities there are there. But I think that there's even more room to introduce these kinds of programs to mitigate the fear of liability and the risks associated, so that pharmaceutical developers and researchers can move into this area. The role of the WHO absolutely is critical. The country perspective, okay, yes. So we have a colleague who independently, she's based in Brazil, and she's been doing some focus groups with women. So the role of women's voices in all of these conversations, I think, are critical. And there's often sort of a, people think, well, women aren't going to want to participate. What woman's going to want to participate in a trial when she's pregnant? She's not going to want to take on those risks. And there have been empirical studies that have interviewed women or had focus groups with them to say, how do you feel about participating in this kind of research? And we saw with H1N1, there was a lot of women that were thrilled to have the opportunity to participate in that kind of research. So I think it's really important to include local voices, both at the higher up level, but also of the people whose needs are most directly affected by the epidemic, and who really have the first person account, to be able to say, yes, this is something that we want and we would find acceptable. There was one last point. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big pushes is really going to be towards having more formal systems in place and having active registries that really are rigorous to be able to collect as much data as possible. Again, because we know there will be inadvertent exposures, we need to capitalize on that and to turn data around much faster so that in the next epidemic, we're prepared.
And so I would also ask if Melba could respond to that when we move on to the group discussion. Yeah. And just one last brief question for...
Yes, thank you. You mentioned that trial participation can provide earlier access to investigate interventions with prospect of direct benefit. Although I completely agree with this statement as a justification, a strong justification to make research, I would like to ask you if you have ever thought about if it can be an undue influence, so women may get confused between research and therapeutic intervention, so as the research has been tailored directly to her. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's always a risk for therapeutic misconception in research, and particularly when you have, a crisis where there's a lot of fear and anxiety. So I think that the place to deal with that might be in the consent process. So if you think that it's an acceptable trial to allow the opportunity for women to participate in, then you have to be very careful in how you communicate the potential risks and benefits to them of participating in the study. But I don't know that therapeutic misconception or the potential for it would be enough of a justification to say we shouldn't go in and do this, or at least have the opportunity on the table.